Thank you all for coming. This is the second of 8 scheduled town hall forums that I'm holding around the city to talk about the March 3rd, 2020 Proposition 2.5 override question that will be on the citywide ballot the same day that we're having the presidential primary election. And the question is very simple. It essentially asks the voters yes or no. Will you allow the city of Northampton to raise an additional $2.5 million in revenue to support the general operating budgets for the city and for the schools? Tonight, I want to talk to you about the case for that, talk a little bit about the history of how we got here, talk about some of the questions people have about how the budget works, and then we're going to have plenty of time for questions about anything else that you don't understand. So I want to go through some slides quickly, and then we'll have time to answer questions. So, renewing our fiscal stability plan, which you may have been hearing a lot about. What is the fiscal stability plan? So back in 2013, the city was facing a approximately $1.5 to $1.7 million budget deficit. And so what we did at that point was I came forward to the city with a proposal to ask the voters for a Proposition 2.5 override, but it was actually in the context of a multi-year plan. So we were not going to just try to fill the gap for that particular year, but we were actually going to take some of the money to fill the gap in 2013, which was then our FY 2014 budget, and then we were going to stockpile some of the additional revenues, not spend it, and use it in the out years to build stability into our budget. This is actually a concept that I borrowed from Arlington, Massachusetts, which had done it successfully several times. So that override was presented to the voters. They did adopt that override. And initially at the time, the original fiscal stability plan, which again, we were talking about FY 2014, we had estimated back sitting in June of 2013 that we thought we could make that plan last for up to 4 fiscal years through 2018. Again, the idea was to use some of the funds to fill the immediate gap in the FY 2014 budget, then stockpile the revenues, and then use it to fill the gaps once we started to get back into a revenue deficit period. What we've actually been able to do is actually make it last 7 fiscal years. So, and that's part of the story that I want to talk to you about tonight. We've been able to take that override that we passed in 2013, and we've been able to, through a combination of economic growth, we've had some good economic growth in the city coming out of the last recession, and we've also benefited from marijuana, which I'll talk to you a little bit about, which I know is on a lot of people's minds. And so we've been able to make it last. We've also worked to create healthcare savings in our budget, which was one of our major budget items, was health insurance. So we've actually been able to make it last through to 2020. So every year since I put forward that proposal to the community, I have come back to the voters, I've come back to the taxpayers every budget year, and I've continued to update them on where we are in the status of this plan. And every one of my budget messages, and these are actually excerpts from every one, I don't expect you to be able to read them in their entirety, but pretty much every year I've said, if our revenue situation doesn't change, we're going to be coming back to you to have a conversation. What do we cut? Or do we want to pass another override? And so I just wanted to sort of show this, that every year I've come back. You've probably seen articles in the paper about the fiscal cliff that I've talked about. We've tried to push it off as far as we could. But unfortunately, here we are. But I just again, for disclaimer purposes, every year I've been updating people and updating the plan with new projections. So, what have we been able to do over the last 7 years with the fiscal stability plan in place? And this is again for the 7 years from FY 2014 to the current FY 2020 budget. I want to just go through sort of what I feel are some of the important ones, and then I can focus in on a few. We've been able to triple the amount of road resurfacing projects that we've done in the city. We've really invested in our infrastructure, and hopefully you've noticed that. We've gone out and really tried to catch up on our deferred maintenance, sidewalks, trails, et cetera. We've been able to restore and expand hours at Forbes and Lilly Library. Some of you may know that over a period of years, we had to close Forbes Library on Saturdays in the summertime. And that was a staffing problem because we didn't have sufficient staffing, because we didn't have the sufficient funds. We've been able to restore those hours and actually add hours at Lilly as well. We've increased senior center hours and expanded a number of programs, including for transportation, nutrition, fitness, and other programs. We've done some nighttime hours for working seniors, and we've even done some weekend hours as well to try to provide more opportunities for seniors. Schools. We've been able to add 53 licensed teaching and therapeutic staff positions to the schools, which we believe has resulted in improved student achievement and more effective social emotional support, and I'll show you some focus on that as well a little bit later. The shade trees. Everyone has been talking about how we've really gone out and tried to re-tree our shade canopy. We've been able to plant over 1,000 new shade trees across the city under this fiscal stability plan. We've had a lot of volunteer help, but the trees have been bought by the city and are maintained by the city, and so it's also required staff and other investment. We've been able to invest in the arts and expand our arts programming and be able to offer many of the new free downtown events and movies and the first night fireworks and other things like that. We've been able to rebuild our reserve funds, which I'll talk about a little bit later in more detail, which has allowed us to then be able to start working on capital improvements to some of our buildings and equipment and other infrastructure like the paving. We've launched major climate initiatives on resiliency and regeneration and green infrastructure and bike share and renewable energy. Many of those, because of the capacity we have through our staffing and through local grant and capital monies. So those are some of the issues we've been able to do. So again, we've been able to implement city and school energy conservation measures and do other things like LED streetlight conversion to save money. We've done facility upgrades to our school roofs and improve some of the HVAC systems. We've been able to invest in technology in our schools, citywide connectivity. We've added a lot of new technology like smartphone apps and things like that. And we've also begun studying broadband because we have a lot of desire for us to look at municipal broadband. The city's been funding feasibility studies of that. We've been working on master plans for our historic cemeteries and our downtowns. We've increased our health department capacity, and we're now leading regional efforts on emergency preparedness, mosquito and tick-borne disease, and then the opioid epidemic as well, leading the Hampshire Hope program. We've created some opportunities for seniors and veterans to be able to get work-offs from their taxes by volunteering for the city. We've been able to maintain competitive salaries for our city and school employees to be able to retain and attract quality staff. And then we've been able to achieve and maintain a AAA bond rating during the 7 years, which has reduced our borrowing costs. So this was our reserve fund. This is looking at a 10-year stretch. So right before I came into office, we had $4,600 in our savings account. That's what our reserves had gotten down to because of the recession, because of the recessions that happened at the end of the 2000s, 2009, 2010. So one of the first orders of business that we needed to work on over the last 7 years was to really begin to rebuild our stabilization funds, which we have worked hard at. You can see we had an A rating from Standard & Poor's when we began that. We've been able to then slowly rebuild them over time. In 2016, which was FY 2017, Standard & Poor's rewarded our work by giving us a AAA bond rating, which is the highest bond rating, which has allowed us to then borrow for those paving projects and those school roof projects at a lower interest rate, which means not having to use as much operating costs for debt service. And you can see where we are right now in FY 20. We have targets and plans, and we have debt policies. Our goal is to be at about 10% of our operating budget. You've often heard the term about having 10% of your salary in the bank. It's a similar metric for municipalities. We're at about 8, a little bit above 8% right now, but we've been very disciplined about that. And here's what Standard & Poor's says in their latest bond rating about the city of Northampton. This was in May of 2019. All of our bond ratings are online. They talk about our strong financial policies and practices, our multi-year forecasting and our 5-year capital planning process. Of particular note, they note the fact that, and we've been talking to the bond rating folks every year about our fiscal stability plan, that in fiscal 24, the voters approved this $2.5 million override, which in our view demonstrated a willingness to raise revenues to meet expenditures, and that was talking about the entire city. And so this is one of the accomplishments we've been able to achieve. But I also people often talk about, well, are you managing the money properly? Are you planning? Are you forecasting? This is not me. This is Standard & Poor's looking at us and giving us a rating that goes out to anyone who's looking at buying our municipal bonds. Yes?
Do we pay for those ratings?
We do, yes. But when we go out on the bond market, we are required. It's one of the things that our bond counsel wants us to do, because it's a way that investors look at our books and look at what they're going to ultimately bid on auction on our bonds.
I looked in the checkbook. I couldn't find any payment to Standard.
You don't purchase it.
You don't purchase it?
You don't purchase it.
No. It's just part of the process as we go through. We have a financial advisor who does the whole bond sale and that whole process of selling our bonds. And at that time, we do a rating call, actually. So right before we go out, right before that bond goes out on an auction, I'm sitting around a table with the finance director, with our auditor, with our outside auditor, and we actually have a phone call with an analyst in New York City from Standard & Poor's who goes through all of our financials, which they have copies of, and they send us a list of 50 questions in advance that they want answers to. We provide all of our audited statements, we provide all of our balance sheets, and then they go back to their team and then they come up with a rating. So right before the bonds go on sale, there's an updated rating. Because nobody's going to buy a bond if the rating is like 3 years old, so they want to have an update.
Standard & Poor's during the 2008 crash, along with Fitch and Moody's, they were actually selling ratings to the people on Wall Street.
Yeah, well, we're not buying our rating. Yeah, and they do all municipalities. I mean, most municipalities, this is how we borrow, and that's the whole municipal bond market. This shows the investments we've made in our infrastructure for transportation, our roads, our bridges, our sidewalks, traffic calming, and paving, which is the largest one in yellow. Chapter 90 is our state funding. At the bottom, you'll see that pretty much has been flat, which is one of the reasons why we continue to fall behind on our paving. So we've been able to invest more into our paving program, which has allowed us to do some of the big roads you've seen us do, like Burt's Pit Road, like we just did Spring Street. We've done Audubon Road, Kennedy Road. We've been able to catch up on a lot of these big roads that are really expensive to tackle. And so we've really made an investment in doing that, and I get a lot of positive feedback from people because they're not ruining their front ends on our potholes and other defects in the pavement. So Northampton Public Schools. This is where we've made a significant investment. I mentioned the 53 full-time equivalent licensed staff positions over the last 7 years that we've added. This is teachers. This is counselors, therapists, support professionals, and you can sort of see over those 7 years the investments we've made. And you can look at our student-teacher ratios during that time, that over those 7 years, standing where we are, well, DESE's numbers are only up to 2019 at this point, but you can see compared to a number of our surrounding communities, we have one of the lower student-teacher ratios, and you can kind of track the progress that we've made there. And that's had a significant impact. We've been able to really make improvements in our schools. When we began this process back in 2013, 2 of our elementary schools were in what was considered level 3 status. And we've been able to move them out of that status We've been able to move the entire district out of a sort of review status. We still have work to do at one of our elementaries with a small cohort of students, but we believe that by these investments, we've been able to improve educational outcomes for children, and particularly children that have social emotional issues and have IEPs or English language learners. So we believe that that is a really important investment that we've made. So Proposition 2.5, which is the reason that we're all here tonight, was adopted in 1980. This was a statewide ballot question. Some of you in the room probably remember it. Barbara Anderson from Citizens for Limited Taxation thought that local spending was out of control and we need to put some kind of a cap on it. So the voters of Massachusetts in a statewide ballot basically voted to implement what we now call as Proposition 2.5. But a lot of people don't really understand how it works. They think my taxes can only go up 2.5%. So I want to just do a quick tutorial on what Proposition 2.5 actually is. And there's some strange terms that you hear that you kind of have to understand in order to see how it works. And I'll show you in the next slide how Prop 2.5 really works. So the levy. When you hear the term levy, it's the total amount of tax revenue that a community raises through its property tax. So it's the grand total of everything that you collect. The levy limit is the prior year's levy plus 2.5% and any new growth. So the 2.5% in Prop 2.5, that's the limit on how much it can grow. New growth is if a new building gets built, a new factory gets built, new homes get built. That obviously gets added to your levy because that's part of that's something new on your tax rate. But the 2.5% cap is what's called the levy limit. There's two sorts of ways you can get around the levy limit. First is a debt exclusion. So a debt exclusion is when you want to renovate your high school, for example, which we did literally 20 years ago. And in that case, you can go to the voters and ask them if you can exceed Proposition 2.5 for the purposes of paying the debt service on a large capital project. Some of you may remember that we did debt exclusion overrides for the high school, for JFK, for the fire station, and for the police station. We have paid off JFK. We have paid off the fire station. We're making the final payment this year on the high school. So the only debt exclusion that we still have on the tax rate will be the police station. So those have slowly moved off the tax rate, which is the way debt exclusions work. An override, which is the legal term, is with the approval of the voters, we can increase our levy limit to fund operating expenses by voting a general override. And I'll talk about a little bit more how that works in the next slide. And then there's another thing called the levy ceiling, which is the total amount you could ever raise with or without an override. So those are just some of the terms that you hear, and now I'll just sort of show you how they actually get applied in practice. So you start with the base levy, which is the levy from the previous fiscal year. So in our case, our FY 2019 levy was $59 million. So that's our levy limit. Then Proposition 2.5 automatically adds 2.5, which is this $1,477,000. Then any new growth that happened in the city, so Village Hill, a bunch of new homes get built on Village Hill, or the new apartment buildings on Pleasant Street, those get added as new growth. So then the levy limit for the city of Northampton is this $61,649,000. So that means that's the total amount we would be allowed to raise in property taxes. We then get to add the debt exclusion, which is the police station, so that gets added on because again, that's the exclusion to Prop 2.5. And then the new maximum allowable levy limit is this $62 million. Our levy ceiling, on the other hand, which is basically 2.5% of the total value of all your property, is actually $92 million. So we could never exceed $92 million. And so our capacity to ask for an override is about $30 million. That's our capacity under Prop 2.5. So that's how and then basically the next year, this levy limit becomes the base levy upon which you then calculate the next year. So that's basically how Prop 2.5 works. So it's really looking at the total of all the taxes that you raise. Fred Zimnock.
Yeah, I hate to get in a lot of questions, but when the property value of my house increases, does that go in there too?
No. So properties get revalued every 5 years in Massachusetts. And so what happens is as values change, the tax rate has to also change because the total amount you raise can't exceed the 2.5%. Sorry about that. So this year we actually had a revaluation year. And so all the properties in Massachusetts got revalued, and there was some growth in people's property because, in 5 years they've gone up in value. We actually then had to lower the tax rate because when you apply that value to the tax rate, you can't raise more than 2.5% in new revenue. So the two kind of move up and down. And again, it's hard to apply it to just your property because every property has an individual valuation. But no, that is not considered new growth. New growth is a new property. So if you if you expand your house and put a new story on it, that would be considered new growth. But just the value of your existing property changing is not considered new growth.
So that doesn't change the levy ceiling?
The levy ceiling itself would move in terms of total values. That's correct. So that would be moving in terms of the total value of all the property times 2.5%. And basically, it's like another way to think about it is that essentially your tax rate could never be more than $25 per thousand, which is interesting because there are some communities in Western Mass that are starting to get close to their levy ceiling. As you'll see later, Longmeadow has a $24 and something tax rate, and they're going to be in a position where they won't even be able to go up 2.5% anymore but that's a whole other issue. Yes, sir.
When is the next property revaluation?
It just happened. So it happens every 5 years. So it just happened. So the tax bills that you got this year.
2019? The 2018 levy for 2019?
I'm looking at it was for 2020. So the 2020 tax bill that you just got and I got and everyone got included the revaluation that occurred. And the state basically assigns it to different, they stagger it across the Commonwealth. So not everybody's being revalued at the same time. So we just got revalued. So that's basically how Proposition 2.5 works. And then every year, like I said, that levy, the base, the levy limit becomes the base for the next year. So when you hear someone say, a general override is built into the levy permanently, that's because you raise the levy and then that becomes the base levy for the next year. So that's what they're referring to when you hear that being built into the base levy. So that's how Prop 2.5 works. So in the 38 years since Proposition 2.5 went into effect, we've passed 3 general overrides. One in 1988 for $650,000. There was one attempted that failed in the 1990s. And then there were 2 in the 2000s, only one passed, and then the one that I referred to earlier in 2013. So we've had 3 general overrides in the almost 40 years since Proposition 2.5 went into effect. I already mentioned the debt exclusions and the ones that are paid off versus the ones that are still on the books. Interestingly, Massachusetts voted in favor of Prop 2.5. Northampton actually voted against it. We were not in favor of Prop 2.5, but obviously it was a statewide initiative. So that's, in terms of how many general overrides we've passed 3 over that 38-year period. This is our tax rate. I mentioned that per thousand tax rate. We look at a bunch of comparison communities around us, either neighbors like East Hampton or South Hadley, or we look at places like Agawam and Chicopee and Westfield, other cities near us. So our residential tax rate right now for FY20 is $16.80 per thousand for both commercial and residential. You can see that it's now the lowest among all of our comparison communities in terms of residential tax rates. So that's what it looks like. I mentioned Longmeadow before, which is at $24.21. So again, they can only go up to $25. And so you may have heard Senator Comerford is having a study commission to look at Proposition 2.5, and particularly to look at its impacts on Western Massachusetts, which hasn't had the same level of economic growth as Eastern Mass has had. So a lot of communities in Western Mass that are built out, that don't have a lot of new industry, their new growth is not going to allow them to keep up with what they need to pay for. So that's a study that's ongoing. I'm not sure what the results of that will be. This is the average single-family tax bill. So again, there's two parts to it. There's your tax rate, and then there's your values. So this is Northampton right here. And you can see Longmeadow, Amherst, the statewide average, East Longmeadow, and then you can see all the other communities. So this is a single-family home tax bill, the average one in the current fiscal year. In Northampton, the average single-family home is valued at $331,635. So that just sort of gives you a comparison to where we fall relative to other communities. This is our general fund budget for FY 2020. It's a little over $100 million. You can see that the largest revenue source is the property tax that we're here to talk about tonight. 66 million of it is in property taxes. The next largest is state revenue. These are all the various state forms of state aid and revenue that we receive. Charges for services is largely we charge tuition to Smith Vocational and Agricultural School. That encompasses parking fees, and it also encompasses ambulance fees. So those are charges for services. And then we have a bunch of other smaller revenue sources. I will highlight in the 2020 budget, because I know we'll talk about it later tonight. This little green sliver is adult use marijuana. So that is what adult use marijuana is currently funding in our current FY 2020 budget. It's interesting to note that state aid, if you looked at this pie chart in 2010, state aid would have been about 23% of our general fund budget. It now constitutes a little over 16%. So we've seen a shrinkage of the amount of state revenue that we've received over time, which has forced more and more onto the local property tax. Did you have a question, Mr. Kirby?
Could you mind backing up to the last chart and just tell us what are those communities that are lower and higher?
Okay, so Longmeadow, Amherst, statewide average. So the statewide average is 6,186. East Longmeadow, Northampton, Westfield, East Hampton, South Hadley, Greenfield, Agawam, West Springfield, Holyoke, and Chicopee. And again, it's important to understand that if you look back at the other chart, you'll see that some communities have split their tax rate. So Holyoke, if you look at this chart, has the highest commercial tax rate, actually, I think in Massachusetts at $39, but their property tax rate for residential is lower. So we're just focusing on residential tax rates here, but that's how it shakes out, and you can see the differential. The chart is online too, Mike, so you'll be able to look at it there as well to get the actual numbers. So that's the pie chart again. That's our revenues. This is our expenditures. This is, again, the current FY 2020 budget that we're in right now. Not unsurprising, the largest portion of our budget is education. Yes, sir.
If an override were to pass, would it affect both commercial and residential tax rates?
It applies to everything. Yeah, it's the total amount of property taxes you can collect. So it's the total levy, yes. So you can see education is the largest part of our budget, public safety, debt service, general government, and then you get down to some of our smaller departments like public works, human services, culture and rec. Again, it's a $100 million budget, so you can pretty much, apply the percentages pretty easily. I would note that education, not only does it include the direct appropriation to the schools, but it includes employee benefits like health insurance, it includes debt service, it includes a number of other services. So when you look at what education actually works out to be, it's actually 55.5% of the total general fund budget. So effectively every dollar we spend, a little over 55 cents of it is going to education. And I think you would find that in most communities, education represents the largest share of most municipalities' budget. And Northampton obviously cares deeply about education, is committed to education, so that makes total sense for us. So the structural imbalance. So Proposition 2.5 imposes an artificial cap on local revenue, while many costs often rise faster than 2.5%. This is the average annual increase in our general fund operating budget, looking out over a 10-year arc. And it's averaged about 3.4% each year, to basically be able to fund and maintain the services that we have and to make the investments that we need to make to continue to provide high quality services and excellent schools. The challenge, of course, is that when you look within the budget, there are many costs that grow much faster than 2.5%, much faster than even the 3.4%. This is just a sampling of 10-year averages of different budgets. We've color-coded them because the blue ones are really fixed costs, like our insurances, charter school sending tuition's a big one that we don't have any control over. Retirement, our contribution to the retirement system. Workers' compensation, for some of you who own businesses, you may recognize workers' comp. And then just looking at some of them, Forbes Library going up at 2.59%. Health, arts and culture, senior services. IT is another area where there's been costs going up over time as we move more to a technology-based society. So that's sort of the fundamental issue with Prop 2.5 is you're capping your largest revenue source at 2.5% growth every year, but your expenses often go up much faster than 2.5%. And so therein lies the structural imbalance that we run into every few years when that gap reaches a point that we start to run into deficits. So that's a sampling of where we grow much faster than 2.5%. So what have we done over the 7 years to try to create savings and to create efficiencies? We've done a number of departmental reorganizations. We've combined several of our offices. We merged our city and school IT departments. We've reorganized our DPW department to try to create more efficient use of resources and delivery of service. We did a big debt refinancing back in 2015 when that was a possibility. We joined the state's Group Insurance Commission, which is which buys for all state employees. So we have the bargaining power of over 500,000 state employees that we now can get our health insurance through. We have disposed of unused city properties. We've sold 3 of our former grammar schools and reinvested those monies into capital projects. We've done a number of energy conservation measures to save money. You may remember my attempt at implementing a pilot program a few years ago in the city with our largest tax-exempt property owners. I would not call it a super success, but we did receive $330,000 from 2 of our largest tax-exempt property owners that we then put into capital improvements. We've made investments in technology to try to, again, streamline, save money, cut down on costs. And obviously the AAA bond rating has been one way that we've been able to save money, take advantage of lower interest rates, and then reinvest in some of our capital to cut down on maintenance and repair costs over time. Think about the leaky roof that you put off fixing for many, many years, then you end up having a much more expensive fix when you reach the point that you actually get around to fixing it. So this is essentially what we're proposing with the fiscal stability plan. You see where we are in 2020, except of course my clicker dies at the wrong moment, the pointer. What we're projecting is that with an additional $2.5 million override, we would be able to extend our stability plan out to what we believe would be 2024, well, actually right out to FY 2025. But essentially, we believe we could build at least 4 years of stability in our budget based on the current projections we have for growth in different areas, as well as what we project in terms of receiving for revenue. So that's sort of what I'm putting forward to the voters. Very similar to 2013. Again, we worked hard to make it last longer, but that's what I'm putting forward to you, to the community right now. So what happens if we say, okay, we don't want to do that, we're done with the fiscal stability plan, let's do something different, or essentially what it means is we're going to need to then start to shrink our services and what we offer either in city and schools because we will not have sufficient revenue growth to be able to meet our our expenses. It's a pretty simple equation. So essentially, this is the cliff that I've been describing for 7 years, that eventually we're going to reach a point where we're going to have another conversation about our local revenue, or we're going to have to start shrinking city government to be able to balance our budget every year. So in the first year, for 2021, our current projection is we will run into about a 1.122 gap in our budget in terms of revenues relative to what we need to spend to provide the services that we're providing. So 1.122, how does that translate into the larger budget? When you just look at the earlier pie charts I showed proportionally, this is sort of how it gets spread out proportionally. Not unsurprisingly, education is one of the largest components of that, about 600,000, public safety, 300,000, and then you can kind of see it spread out. The challenge is that because those fixed costs will continue to rise, we'll get back into a mode that we were in 2013, where pretty much every year we start the year by saying we need to level fund all the departments, so what do we cut in order to get to level funding? And so that's sort of what the fiscal stability plan was about. Let's get out of that mode. Let's make an investment as a community. Let's fill the gap that we have now. Let's continue to spend responsibly and transparently, and make investments that people want in the community and make it last longer. So that's essentially what we're looking at, sort of the options in terms of the budget that I have to create to submit to the city council. So for example, the school department right now is working on developing what's called the first view budget that they present to the school committee. They're going to be basically looking at it. They have to turn that in to me by April, but they have to get it to the school committee by February to let them have a chance to work on it. So I think over the month of February, the superintendent's going to be presenting sort of two scenarios. Here's the budget with the fiscal stability plan renewed, and here's a budget where we have to constrict by, again, close to $600,000. So that will start to come a little more into focus as we get into the school budget process. And then I would have to do the same thing as part of the city budget process. So, what about the pot money? I get asked this question all the time. I showed you in the earlier slide that we are already using 1.2 million of pot revenues. There's basically two types of pot revenues that we receive, or adult use cannabis. I don't mean to use the same shorthand that the newspapers seem to love, but there's two types of adult use marijuana revenue. The first is the local option excise tax, which is on the left. So when you go and make a purchase, it's a 3% tax that's collected at the register. It is then sent to DOR, who then sends it back to the city a couple of months later. It's exactly what happens when you pay your meals tax. It's exactly what happens when you pay hotel motel tax. It comes back to the city. You can see what our first quarters, we've only had 4 quarters of it to begin with. We've had 4 quarters, and last year when we were building our budget, there was no industry at that point. Nothing had been allowed to open. So we were making some estimates at the time with no previous experience to base it on. So we built $1.2 million of adult use marijuana revenue into the current budget. We're currently projecting, as part of the stability fund, about $1.8 million in revenue. But this is a really tricky one because there's only about 40 retailers that are currently licensed in the state, and there's hundreds of them waiting to open, or that have applications in the queue. So we don't know what's going to happen when all of those open. We don't know what's going to happen to prices. We don't know what's going to happen to the market. Northampton was obviously in early, so we've benefited from it, but we don't really know long term. So that's one that we're going to continue to look at and be conservative with, but the marijuana revenue has helped us. It's actually helping us lower the amount of an override that we need. We actually, if we had not had that additional $1.2 million in revenue, I probably would have been having this town hall a year ago because we wouldn't have been able to extend that extra year to 7 years. And then because of that revenue, that we collected in 2019, we're actually lowering the amount of the total override that we're asking for because we're going to use that to help stabilize in those out years. So we aren't asking for the full, we're basically able to do it for just a $2.5 million override at that point. If we didn't have the pot money, we would have been running into a deficit much earlier, and it would have taken a larger override to be able to overcome that deficit. The other type of money, which is over on the right, I've sort of segregated them, is the host community impact fee. That is a 5-year limited revenue, so it's during the first 5 years of operation, and we sign a host community agreement with all of our operators. There's only one so far, and basically the host community impact fee is to be used to mitigate the impacts of operations upon the city's road system, law enforcement, inspection services, permitting services, et cetera. Again, we've collected 4 quarters of it so far. We've used about 900,000 of it to pay for many of the traffic and paving and sidewalk improvements around Netta. You may have seen we did paving on Pleasant Street, we did Fulton Avenue, we did Wright Avenue, we've added crosswalks. So we've been putting it into those projects, which has then freed up money for projects in other parts of the city. But this is not a revenue that we want to build into our general operating budget because it's only 5 years, and then it's going to go away. So we wouldn't want to hire people, pay salaries with it, because once it runs out, then it's not coming back. So that is the marijuana money. It is being used now. It's been used in the current budget. We're projecting it into the next budget. It's helping us extremely. I mean, it's helping us immensely. And again, it's extended our stability and lowered the overall size of the override we need to balance our budget. The other big question that I've heard about is the major education reform bill that some of you have heard about. That's making a historic investment in public education in Massachusetts. That's the Student Opportunity Act. The Student Opportunity Act was an update in the foundation budget, which was part of the original Chapter 70 law that went into effect to make sure that children in Massachusetts were being provided an equal education. Those formulas hadn't been updated in many years. They just did a major update to them. The challenge is that pretty much the majority of the benefit is going to the poorest communities in Massachusetts, where it should, because those children have fallen the farthest behind in terms of the income disparity. So while it's doing incredible things for students across the Commonwealth, Northampton is a minimum aid community under Chapter 70. So we're really going to see essentially $30 per student each year, which is about $554,000 over the next 7 years. And that's really not a major change from what we've been receiving under Chapter 70. We've been getting, I've got the total history up here on the chart.
Yeah, just jammed an eraser.
Okay, good. That you can see over the course of Chapter 70, but even the last few years, we got a 1% increase in Chapter 70. We got a 1.1%. So basically, think about it this way. In FY 2020, the year we're in, we got an $81,000 increase in our education aid from the state on a $36+ million school budget. And unfortunately, that's how it's going to play out most likely over the 7 years. Again, the Student Opportunity Act was important and significant, but it's really not going to have a major impact for Northampton. Similar slide that I showed in terms of state aid. If you look back, we're currently getting 19% of our spending on education is coming from state aid. If you went all the way back, to the 80s, we were getting 33%. If you just went back, 10 years, we were getting almost 25% of our aid from the state. So, of course, when state aid shrinks, who makes up the difference? It falls on local municipalities and the property tax. So that's the picture in terms of education funding. The other challenge that we have is that charter school funding has enormous impacts on Northampton. We have several charter schools around us. And the way the funding works for charter schools has had a very negative impact on Northampton. You can see that the charter school sending tuition for FY 2020, 2.7 million went out of Northampton to these other communities to pay for charter schools. So when you combine an incredible growth in charter school expenses, and then you have a fairly flat amount of Chapter 70 aid, that further causes an imbalance in our budget and our ability to fund our schools and frankly to fund our entire city budget. So there's still reform that has to happen in terms of how charter schools are funded, and that's a longer conversation that was not included in the Student Opportunity Act. There was a commitment to fully fund charter school reimbursement as part of the Student Opportunity Act, which we've been underfunded total since 2014, about $800,000. That's going to have some impact, but it's going to be in the thousands of dollars, not in the types of numbers that we're talking about in terms of our ongoing educational expenses. So, what is the impact of this additional $2.5 million in revenue that we're asking you to raise? Essentially, the easiest way to calculate it, because everybody's property is different, is to just essentially say that in order to raise $2.5 million, we would have to add an additional 67 cents to that per thousand tax calculation. And so what that translates into for the average single-family home, the $335,000 average single-family home we talked about earlier, well, that's actually what we're projecting for 2021, it would add $225 per year or $56 per quarter to that average single-family tax bill. Just looking at some general numbers, if you had a property valued at $100,000, this additional $2.5 million would be an extra $17 in your quarterly bill, on and on and on. If you want a precise number, we've created a calculator on the city's website that basically allows you to put in your name or your parcel number, and it'll do the calculation for you. So here's this guy named Narkewicz, David J., who lives where he lives. And so I can see that $2.5 million added to our tax rate is going to basically mean $49.31 a quarter to my bill. So that's essentially for my personal bill, but obviously everybody's property is valued differently. And so I would, for folks who want to actually understand, because again, it's not 2.5% increase to just my bill or your bill, it's the overall tax levy, and then that gets spread out among all the different values in the city. So the tax calculator is there to give you an understanding of what that does to your particular property. We've also, as part of the override, we've expanded property tax relief for income eligible seniors. We've reduced the requisite age of eligibility from 70 to 65. We've increased the maximum exemption from $650 to $1,000 per year. These are all exemptions that are allowed for low-income seniors under Mass General Law. And we've increased the income limitations and we've increased the asset limitations because we understand one of the challenges with a property tax is that it's not a tax on income, it's a tax on the value of your property. And if you are someone who bought your property 20 or 30 or 40 years ago and now you're no longer working, that increase can have an impact. So there are this program and other programs that the assessor makes available to be able to mitigate the possible impacts on low-income seniors in particular.
David, can I just ask one question?
Sure.
Does that mean they pay no extra tax if they qualify?
No. What it basically means is they would be eligible, if they qualified, they would be eligible to have $1,000 taken off their tax bill. So that $335,000 annual, the $5,000 annual tax bill would have $1,000 taken off of it, abated, if they meet the qualifications. So that's the tax relief that we're providing for seniors to make sure that they're not negatively impacted. In terms of resources that we have on our website, again, I've mentioned all of the information is available, all of our budgets, all of our capital programs, our audits, all those bond ratings and trust fund reports. We have an open checkbook program, which allows you to actually look and see spending on a day-to-day, month-to-month basis across different departments. We have a really great tool that I would encourage you to try called Visual Budget, which basically allows you to take your tax bill, what you pay in taxes, put it into the system, and then it'll actually show you dollar for dollar where your dollars are going. I did this recently on social media. I paid my $1,300 quarterly bill, and then I can see that like $22 of that goes to Forbes Library, and $75 of that goes to the fire department, and $500 and something of it goes to the schools. And I think it's important for people when they think about it in that context. I mean, we have some of the best public safety departments in this region. When you dial 911, we have some of the best response times. We have some of the best trained paramedics, fully equipped. So for me, when I think about, okay, is that worth $25 a month to me to have that, to know when I call 911 that I'm going to get an ambulance, and the same with police, and the same with schools. A quarter. Well, what I was saying is it's $75 a quarter, which I think is $25 a month. My finance director's checking my math here, which is good. That's why she's the finance director. But it really lets you see where your tax dollars are going, and I would encourage people, because really the budget is a reflection of our values as a community. It's the choices we want to make as a community. And so I think that to really understand where your tax dollars are going, this is a great way to do it, and to really see what that $2.5 million in additional revenue is going to help us continue to do. So those are the resources that are available. I'm doing these town hall meetings all around the city. I've got a daytime meeting scheduled next week for those who can't make a nighttime meeting. And then we have the primary on Tuesday, March 3rd, which is also Super Tuesday. There will be early voting, so you can go 5 days early. But Tuesday, March 3rd, there'll be a separate ballot. There'll be one question on it, and the question is yes or no. Shall the city be allowed to raise an additional $2.5 million in revenue to fund our city and schools? So that's my presentation, and now I'll open it up to questions that people may have about either the plan or about the override. Yes, sir.
What are the schools that were closed and sold as surplus?
So these were schools that were closed many, many decades ago, but the city had kept them in their inventory. One of them was South Street School. One of them was the Florence Grammar School. And then the other one was in Fiker School. Yeah, Fiker School, which had been long closed for many years, for going on 20 years.
Why didn't the proceeds go into the education fund?
So
rather than the capital improvement.
So it went into the school capital fund. So what happened was we used the proceeds to fund, interestingly, we used it to fund new roofs on 3 of our schools, is what we used the proceeds for. So the thing to understand is that when you looking at budgeting and municipal budgeting, you have one-time revenue, and then you have ongoing revenues. So when you get a revenue from a sale of a building, actually under Mass General Law, you can only use the money for a capital expense. Because again, if you took that money, that's a one-time revenue, and you put it into the operating budget, once you spend it, it's not coming back. So we did put it toward education. So each one of those school buildings, we used the money to fund a capital need in our schools. Mostly it was infrastructure in our existing schools. And that's one of the reasons why we decided, why are we holding on to these buildings and renting them when we still have the liability, we still have the overall, capital liability for the buildings. Let's sell them, and let's reinvest those monies in our current capital in the schools we are operating. So that's the answer.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, ma'am.
Besides the senior low-income reduction of $1,000, isn't there also a senior citizen volunteer program?
Yes, I mentioned the tax work-off program. That's something we implemented about 4 or 5 years ago, and that essentially lets a senior that meets income eligibility or a veteran be able to work, basically volunteer their time in one of our city departments, and we have about 30 or 40 of them that are working in Forbes, in our schools, at the senior center, and they're actually able to receive up to $1,500 in credit towards their tax bill. And again, that's a state program. So we've had that for several years, and we've had a lot of people, and we have a lot of really incredibly talented retirees in our community who are able to really give us a lot of help in our departments, but at the same time save on their taxes. So that program is in place. And there are some other programs for people that are blind, for disabled veterans. There's a number of different categories. They're all allowed under state law. But if there was something we could implement, we've implemented it. We've tried to the extent possible, make these available to all of our residents. Sort of a tie. I'll go to the back and then I'll come back to you, Susan.
You focused a lot on the general fund, but I'm curious about the special funds, the stormwater, the sewage, water. When you made the comparison among the different cities and towns in West Massachusetts, was that also, your peer communities, were those funds common among all of them, or is it possible that some of those other towns were including those in their general revenue?
No, this is strictly general fund, and this is all data compiled by DOR. So the city also has 4 separate, they're called enterprise funds. They're basically our utilities. So our water utility, our sewer utility, we have our solid waste utility and our stormwater and flood control utility. Those are all fee-based. They're all separate mini budgets. They're not funded with property taxes. They're funded with the fees that you pay when you buy your stickers or when you pay your water bill, utility bill. Those are all accounted for separately. So those numbers that we pulled in terms of general, the tax rate, that is all comparative data. So we're comparing apples to oranges. Now, there may be some communities that don't have utilities, that maybe they're too small and they don't even have that. But this is general fund revenue to general fund revenue and general fund taxes to general fund taxes. So that's the comparison. We don't really include the utilities here because it's not it's not what property taxes are paying for, and it's not part of the general fund revenue. If we have to make investments in our wastewater treatment plant, that's a separate conversation about those fees, because it's a separate cost center, and all the fees can only be used to fund whatever the purpose of that cost center is. Susan.
I have 2 questions, if that's
Yes.
okay. The first one is, when you have the $1,000 reduction for low-income seniors, are those types of reductions, are we doing the maximum allowed by state law?
Yes.
And continuing on that, is there anything you can do for low-income people who are not seniors, or is it only?
Yeah, we've 1,000 is the max, and 65 is the max in terms of age. I've had this question before. Yeah, and Susan Wright mentions that we also offer that similar discount for the CPA, and we also offer that similar discount. So if you qualify for it, you get it not only on your property tax, you get it on the CPA, you get it on your water and sewer, and you get it on your stormwater. So we've tried to spread it out. But in terms of, are there low-income exemptions for just low-income generally? There's not.
Okay. So we're doing the most we can do.
We're doing the most we can do with the tools we've been given, but there's not a program that looks at low-income just generally. That requires a state law that the state would have to enact.
And then my other question, if you don't mind, is with going back to the adult use cannabis money.
Yes.
The bucket that goes away in 5 years that right now is 1.8 million, and you described $900,000 was used for infrastructure nearby.
Yeah.
Where's the other 900,000?
We've got the first 2 quarters of it, and we're still working on how we're going to implement that. Again, we have a agreement, and it has to be related to the impacts of the industry. So I've been actually talking with our health department about that, and potentially some public health initiatives that we can work on. But I can't really use it to fund the general fund, because that's not really what it's used for. What it can be used for, plus it's going to go away. So it's sort of a separate conversation, but we are looking at ways that we can use it to mitigate impacts related to NETA generally. And there's some other safety improvements and other some public safety related and also some public health related issues that we may use that to address. And I've actually been talking to our health department and the Prevention Coalition about some of those ideas. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I have a couple questions if I could. So the $2.5 million that you're asking for is actually, that's the revenue for the single year of the impact of changing the tax rate, is that right?
That is correct. It will raise an additional $2.5 million in revenue above what we're allowed to raise under Prop 2.5.
And that will be a permanent increase in the tax rate, so that $2.5 million will be there
Yes, that's
every
true.
subsequent year.
That is correct.
Okay.
Can I just say though, because I just, if you would allow me, because I've heard this before, that like that's forever. And I guess what I would say to people is that our inflation is forever too. Like when our health insurance goes up 3%, they don't go back to the previous year's amount to then put the, yeah, so I mean, it's built, those other expenses.
Currently raising your revenue base.
Exactly, that's correct.
Now, if my fuzzy math is right, it looks to be about a 4% tax increase. If you're raising $66 million from the property taxes right now, you want another 2.5, that's about 4%, a little under 4%.
Without checking your, without going through the numbers that, well, you've got the 2.5% plus you've got the other increase, so that's, could be correct, yeah.
Right.
But again, it's hard to give a hard and fast number until all the other values and all the other
change
things.
in the mill rate, it's about 4%, or so about the same.
Exactly.
Is it safe to assume that every single year you have a 2.5% tax increase?
That's been built
Based
into,
on the budget?
that's correct, yes.
Okay.
And that's automatically the levy goes up 2.5% under Prop 2.5, yes.
So this year, then, you're asking for over 6% of the tax increase.
Plus new growth.
3 thereabouts.
Plus, and the new growth is part of that, which is not.
And the assumption I'm going to make is the way you increased your reserves is by building in surpluses every year. Is that right?
We have we basically, when we build our budgets every year, we try to be conservative in our estimates because we obviously don't want to underestimate and come up with a revenue deficit at the end of the year. But one of the things that happens every year is we have at the end of every fiscal year, the Department of Revenue then looks at all of our expenditures, all of our revenues, and then figures out how close we came to our budget. The target that we are told we should be shooting for is, between 5 to 10% in terms of being conservative in terms of our estimates. So every year there's this additional leftover money from every budget that is sent back to us as a result of that. That's what we've primarily used to pay for capital every year. We pay for our capital improvement program, and then we've put some of it into our different stabilization funds to rebuild it.
Right. So, for
Yes.
example, if you're going to raise the taxes, let's say it's 6.3% from your budget plus this, but your expenditure increase this year, I think, was 4%, then your intent is to take that extra money and put it in these funds.
It is, but the main fund that we're going to use it is this fiscal stability fund, which is separate from our other stabilization funds, which is the one that we're actually using some of the revenue this year to fund our operating budget, and we used some of it last year to fund our operating budget. And the plan is in the out years, when we start to get into another spread, we'll use it to then be able to fund our operating budget to extend our stability longer. So that's correct. So there's actually different funds, but yes, it's correct that when we've had leftover money at the end of a fiscal year that wasn't spent, and that can happen for a number of reasons. You have vacancies in departments, you have turnover, a high-ranking officer retires and you hire a rookie police officer, so you end up. So what we've done is we haven't spent that on new programs. We've actually said we've got to have the discipline to put that into our reserve funds to rebuild those. And so that's sort of, and then the additional revenue from the override we've put into this fiscal stability fund, which has been used to then help stabilize our budgets over the last several fiscal years. But that is how we've done it. That is correct. Yep. Yes.
So I need to ask a very fundamental and simple question. When I'm making up my budget every year. I figure out, what do I absolutely have to spend? And from there, I have priorities. What would I like to spend, but what's gonna fit in the budget? The override, and I've lived here 22 years, so this is my third override. The override feels to me like, the young adult who's expecting mom and dad will parachute in with some extra money. So I don't really need to stress too much about those things that I'd really like, but I don't have enough income to provide. I haven't had a mom and dad to parachute in to give me money for 50 years now. I'm not happy to be mom and dad.
Well, I mean, my only response to that is, I mean, the way we fund our city is all of us in this room and beyond, we pool our resources to fund the services that we want. And so it's not abstract. I mean, this is, you know, if we want to maintain the services that we have, and we want our roads to be plowed, and we want to have good schools, and we want our library to be open on Saturdays in the summer, or we want to replant our shade tree canopy, or any of these other things that people want us to do, there's a cost associated, and the primary way that we fund that is through this property tax. So we feel, I mean, I understand the concern you're expressing, but we also, I believe that we provide really excellent services in the city, and that's one of the reasons why we are so attractive as a city. It's one of the reasons why, you know, we've had strong economic growth, because businesses want to locate in a city that has strong schools and strong services. And I think Proposition 2.5 did not say there'll never be a tax increase over 2.5%. It just said you have to ask the entire populace to approve it. That's really all it said. It didn't say, I don't think anyone could have said we're going to put a 2.5% cap in 1980, and that's going to provide all the money that's necessary. Actually, I think it was really designed to constrain local spending, and the idea was to put it onto the state government to take over more of the responsibility, which I fully agree with. The challenge is that on the same day that we passed Proposition 2.5, we elected Ronald Reagan as the President of the United States, who began to fundamentally change the tax system in the United States and completely lower, you know, the maximum tax rates. Then we've proceeded to elect a series of Republican governors in Massachusetts who've run on no new taxes and the income tax level. Actually, our income taxes went down this year to 5%. The governor just announced that with great fanfare. And that's wonderful, except when I'm in a room with legislators and the governor, and I've said this to the governor, yeah, you're saying you're lowering taxes, but you're actually raising taxes because you're forcing more of the cost to cities and towns. So it's a shell game. And again, property taxes are a regressive way to raise taxes, but it's the only thing we have. We've availed ourselves of every other, you know, marijuana. You know, I think I was the first person to buy it, you know, east of Colorado. That's how excited we were for this new revenue. We've done the meals tax. We've done other, if there's a new revenue, Airbnb, we've tried to implement every other revenue that's possible besides the property tax, but that's all we have. And so the conversation is never easy, but that's the mechanism we've been given. So I totally understand your perspective. And that's why the choice is in your hands and in the other 28,000, you know, residents of Northampton. Where do we want to go in the future? What services do we want? Because I will, you know, if I can only use the revenues we have, and so if the choice is no, then we're going to have to, you know, look at our budget and make cuts, and that, you know, will obviously affect people, and it'll affect the services we provide. So there's a real impact between the two. So I totally appreciate your view, but it's in a larger context. Yes, ma'am, and then I'll come back to you, sir.
The question I've been wanting to ask, and you just brought it up, is what else has been looked at for generating revenue besides raising non-commercial property taxes? So I drive down King Street and I see all that vacant property and I'm wondering about maybe marijuana cultivation. I drive down Main Street, Northampton, and I see these empty buildings that are owned by a landlord. Why can't we get a way to tax empty buildings that are left empty for a while at a different rate? Is there a way to come up with another way to raise money for the town of Northampton?
So, obviously, so King Street's a perfect example. One of the reasons why we've had such strong economic growth has been development on King Street. There's been a ton of development on King Street and you may have just seen a building got torn down last week. That's an expansion of the development that already happened at the former Price Chopper. And so there is one lot, the former Honda lot, which is owned by a property owner that's looking for the perfect tenant. But there's been a lot. Think about King Street, even just 7 years ago. I mean, Cole Morgan was there. That got torn down. They moved to Village Hill. The new auto dealerships were built. The Price Chopper, which I had heard a lot about from people, why aren't we developing the Price Chopper? Now it's Bay State Medical Center's, Western Outpost here in Hampshire County, and they built the Greenfield Savings Bank, and they've built the People's Bank. So there's actually been a ton of development on King Street, and there's been development at Village Hill. So we're doing everything we can to support. Actually, that low commercial tax rate that we have is actually one of the things that helps spur that development, because when people are looking, and the CEO of Cole Morgan has told me when he was talking to the corporate folks, the reason why he was able to convince them to stay in Northampton and not go to Westfield or Chicopee was we had a low commercial tax rate. So the vacancies, they are still paying full property tax on those vacancies.
Why can't we punish them and make them
Well,
pay
if
more?
the state enacted that, I know that some places have flirted with, Cambridge does not have, they do not have a vacancy tax. So some communities have done what's called it's a vacancy registration program, where basically they are requiring owners of vacant properties to register their properties on a list of vacancies, and they pay like $500 a year to register them. And so I can tell you that if somebody who's foregoing $10,000 a month in rent, a $500 registration fee is not going to change. So if there was going to be a vacancy tax, that would have to be something that would be authorized by the legislature. And I'm sure economists could tell you all the possible ramifications of that. But vacancies, I think when you look at our vacancies downtown, there is definitely one property owner who has a lot of vacancies. But then we've also had a lot of turnover in other properties. I mean, just in the last month, we've had 3 new businesses come to downtown and locate. You may have heard Ode closed at the end of December. There's already a new clothing store coming in next month. We had Glazed Donut close, and now there's a new restaurant in there. So there's a lot of new entrepreneurs. A lot of our property owners are turning over their properties quickly, but there is one particular property owner who likes to leave them vacant, but he is paying full property tax. I can't talk about his income tax or any of those things, but he's paying full property tax on those properties. In terms of marijuana, there are options on several properties on King Street for marijuana.
Cultivating.
Well, cultivating, we have a large cultivation facility that has been permitted that's out on Ryan Road at the old Willard Gravel Pit. We also have some smaller sort of craft cultivators who've applied for permits in some of our mill buildings. We've got some other processors and we've got some retailers. The problem is the Cannabis Commission has a backlog of applications and no one knows how long it's going to take to get a license. So many people are paying rent on spaces for a year, 2 years, and they don't know when they're going to get a license. So there are people looking at marijuana in some of these Papagenos. You all know Papagenos on King Street. Well, there's a marijuana person, a company that's looking at redeveloping that into a retail store. So there are there are folks out there, and that will be new revenue, and that'll be new jobs, which is great. The problem is we don't know when that new revenue will come online because of the whole Cannabis Commission and how long it's taking for them to process applications. So that would be my rather long-winded answer to those answers. Yes? No. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, and then I'll come back to you, sir.
If this doesn't pass, what can we see as some of the immediate effects?
Well, I mean, the immediate effect is that we are going to have to, obviously constrict our budgets in those major categories. So in the schools, for example, we would have to try to find, $600,000 in savings in our school budget, which would, be, it's obviously, it's a large budget, but as I've told many people many times, really 90% of our budget is people. That's what we do. I mean, we're a people organization, whether it's police officers, firefighters, plow drivers, teachers, paramedics. And so what you have to do to reduce a budget is reduce staff, which then gets back to the conversation about class size and student-teacher ratio and all of the academic supports that we've been able to provide. Many people may not realize this, but our schools have changed dramatically over time in terms of the people that we serve. And we have such a higher percentage of children in our schools that are economically disadvantaged, or they have trauma, or they have social emotional issues, or they're English language learners. And we have to provide services to all of those students. So that has really risen our costs. And we want to pay those costs because that's what public schools are all about. We take every child wherever they are and we try to educate them. But that becomes challenging when you have less staff, less support staff, less ELL staff. And so those are the kind of impacts you'll start to slowly see over time. And even as something as simple as just the library hours. I've been meeting with the Forbes trustees for many years. How do we figure out how are we going to get Saturday hours at Forbes Library when all the kids are on school vacation and the library is not open on Saturday? We've slowly been able to increase their budget and find some other savings that they've been able to reopen the library on Saturday. So those are the impacts you're going to see because it's really about we need to have enough staff to keep the library open on Saturday. It's a pretty simple equation. When you talk about public safety, it means response times. It means how many police officers we have patrolling the city. When you call 911, and their call volumes have been going up exponentially because our police officers are now social workers and crisis interventionists, and they're drug interventionists, and they're doing a lot of other things that police officers didn't traditionally do. So, and you can go across the board. It really comes down to the services that you expect, many people expect as a city, and that's what your tax dollars pay for. Yes, sir.
I want to come back to the issue of the tax rate on commercial industrial.
Yes.
If I can remember your chart,
Yeah.
Northampton is still amongst the lowest in the region for that.
Yes,
So it looks
indeed.
like, frankly, there's some room to move on that to raise some revenue apart from the homeowners. So why hasn't the city done that?
So a few communities have done that. So the first thing to understand is that by splitting the tax rate, you don't raise more revenue. You raise the same amount of revenue, and you're still constrained by 2.5. You're just shifting the burden onto commercial taxpayers versus residential taxpayers.
So for the homeowners.
That is true. The big challenge we have in Northampton is that unlike, so about 80% of our tax base is residential, 20% is commercial. And we have a pretty high percentages of small locally owned businesses, which is why we love Northampton. And we don't have mega corporations. We have, I guess Coca-Cola would qualify. But we don't have huge corporations. Many of our business owners downtown don't own their property. They rent. And so we've made a conscious decision, and our assessors have recommended that we not go that direction. And what you see in Holyoke, unfortunately, is that Holyoke, year after year, kept pushing more and more of their property tax rate over onto the commercial side. They had the paper mills, they had the mall, the paper mills closed, most malls are struggling. Now they find themselves with the highest commercial tax rate in Massachusetts, and they're having a challenging time attracting businesses to their community because nobody's going to locate there and pay $40 per thousand. So we've made a conscious effort to keep our tax rate at a single tax rate, and we've talked to communities and we've seen studies of communities who've moved in that direction, because the problem is, in Holyoke's case, the only way to lower that property tax for commercial is to raise residential. So once you go, it's not easy to come back. So we've really made the decision because of small, locally, we have Seluzniak Funeral Home. We don't have Acme Funeral Home. We don't have like an international funeral home. We have locally owned businesses. And these are people that invest in our community and hire in our community and live in our community. And so that's, I'm sorry to call you out, Jay Seluzniak, but that's a free commercial, I guess. Yes, exactly. I spend a lot of time there, and other funeral homes, in fairness, but because mayors do that, I'm sorry. It's not a side job, it's just I go to a lot of wakes, I'm sorry, it's a thing. So that's really the conscious decision we've made to keep a single tax rate. And I think if you can look at a lot of studies and talk to a lot of communities that regret going the commercial rate way. So again, you'll end up punishing small businesses. It'll go to property owners who are just going to push that onto rents of small businesses, and then we have the vacancy issue that we talk about, that rents are already high. So that's the challenge. So that's why we've kept the single tax rate versus a split tax rate. I mean, a place like Chicopee or Westfield, which has 60% residential, 40, in some cases 50-50, I think they're able to do that. But when you look at Riverdale Road or Agramart and Costco, and those people aren't going to feel that. But in Northampton, small family-owned businesses are going to feel that, and that's going to put pressure on them. Yes, sir.
I had a question about the unfunded pension liabilities and the strain that's putting on the city budget. I've tried to get information online. It's really hard to get current information.
Yep.
But I understand a few years ago the city started to pay a $2 million a year levy in order to try to fill that $30 million hole in those liabilities. How is the city managing that? Is that a big part of this issue that we're dealing with? Is that we're having to sort of sink more and more money into these unfunded liabilities?
So there's two things. So we have a retirement system, the Northampton Retirement Board, which is a separate entity, and that is managed and invested, and there's actuarial tables and all that. And the city is required every year to fund so much into the retirement fund to meet the retirement obligations. By law, we have to have fully funded that system by, what date is it again, Susan?
2040.
2040, we're required to have fully funded that system. And so every couple of years, the retirement board does an actuarial study, and they look at what does our contribution have to be, and they're looking at the stock market, they're looking at longevity. So that's definitely a commitment. And again, it fluctuates depending on the stock market and depending on the actuarial tables. And it is one of those costs, when you look at that chart, that's been going up at about 5.75%. But that's not a cost we can cut or control. That's an obligation that we are required by state law. The other thing you might be thinking about is something that's called OPEB, which is other post-employment benefits. And that's a separate issue which the state, federal government has been looking at. And it's essentially this concept that you have these other obligations, including health insurance, the other things beyond a pension that you're required to pay. We obviously fully fund our health insurance on a pay-as-you-go basis, and we've never not paid for any of that. But OPEB is something that it's called GASB, it's like the Private Accounting Standards Board, has been looking at. So we have created a fund, an OPEB trust fund, that we've been putting a little bit of money into every year. And we're required to have an assessment done of that liability. But our focus right now is on the retirement liability. And then once we pay that off in 2040, then we would probably focus on the OPEB. The OPEB And it's something that, Standard & Poor's looks at. They look at that. I mean, the idea is that it's a part of your balance sheet, even if you're meeting your obligations, but it is a liability out into the future, health insurance, for ongoing employees. But we're not, we've made us a commitment to that, but what is our OPEB liability? It's going to be scary. It's like $125 million is our OPEB liability out in the future. But again, we're meeting all of our obligations. So it's sort of an accounting thing. But we do have a small trust fund that we've started to show the rating agencies that we're working on it. But I wouldn't call the OPEB one a major drag on the budget. The retirement one is definitely one of those expenses that fluctuates every year. It may go up 6%, it may go up 4%, it may go, and that's our contribution that we have to put in as a city to that fund. So that's one that we don't have a choice. It's a fixed expense, and it's part of our obligation to our retirees.
So even with the stock market going up 14% a year on average over the past decade, that liability's increased 5-6% a year?
I have a member of the retirement board here, the finance director. You're starting to get into her territory now. This is Susan Wright, by the way, and all of this and everything in my brain would not be possible without Susan Wright. She's our finance director, she's our CFO, and so I have to thank her, but she also serves on the retirement board.
Right. So the interest rate that we're using for our actuarial evaluations is 7.375. And that has been roughly the average. We've been at about 9% over the last 10 or 15 years. But we use 7.375 because right now we've had bad years and we've had good years, and it fluctuates. But we are regulated by PERAC, which is the state's retirement system, and they do govern pretty much everything we do. But what the mayor said, in 2040, when the city has completely gotten the retirement system to full funding, we won't be contributing anymore, and retirees and city employees will be fully funding their own pensions at that point. So it is just to get us to 2040, and then the city's contribution, which right now is around $6 million, in 2040 will probably be around 10 million. That 10 million will be freed up in the budget, and then we will use it to start attacking the retiree health insurance issue. But we are regulated, and we are using 7.375 as our percentage rate.
And so you said it's $6 million now. 10 years ago, was the city making any payment into that fund, or is that something that just started?
The city has always been making payments into it, but it was in the 80s that the retirement systems became regulated, and we were put under the onus of having to fully fund. Originally, it was going to be 2030, and then because even the state system is not as well funded as our own system, they moved the goalpost to 2040.
But even the types of investments we're allowed to invest in are controlled by PERAC as well. So. For obvious reasons, because they don't want people making crazy, investments and then people's retirement funds. But our Northampton Retirement Board has been one of the top rated in terms of returns, I believe, the last several years, if you look at PERAC's system, at their ratings every year. So those are just some of the liabilities that are, we often, people say, why don't you run the city like a business? Well, we're a $100 million business with 1,000 employees and hundreds of retirees. And if you're in business, paying for pensions and paying for health insurance is part of running your business. So these are some of the obligations that we have to deal with. But I would not say that we certainly do not have extravagant pensions. What is the average pension, Susan?
It's between 25 and 30.
It's like $25,000 to $30,000 is the average pension for a Northampton retiree. Teachers are in a different retirement system. That's a state system. But again, that's one of our obligations. So hopefully that answers your questions. But we can give you more information if you want it. If you want to look at actuarial tables or other things, we can share that with you as well. If you're having a sleepless night and want to read actuarial tables. Sure, and then I have Mr. Kirby. Yes.
Yeah. Do you have any idea of what the comparative payment of other colleges and universities are to the towns that they're located in with regard to Smith? And do you have a strategy for encouraging Smith to participate more fully?
So two answers to that. Every override, or every time we've ever had a budget crunch, typically people say, why don't you ask Smith College for more money, like is what you're saying. So after the last override, and we got into this fiscal stability plan period, I decided, let's not do it during a crisis situation. Let's actually have a conversation with our largest tax-exempt property owners, of which Northampton has a pretty high number of them. When you think about the VA hospital and Cooley Dickinson Hospital and the college and all the other tax-exempt properties, if you look at a list statewide of cities in Massachusetts, in terms of percentage of property that is tax-exempt, I think we're 7 on the list in terms of cities. That's also a good thing because these are great institutions and they provide a lot of value to the community. And actually, Smith College is the largest taxpayer in the city for property tax. But yes, they do have a significant amount that is exempt. So I think it was 2 years ago or so, I held another series of town halls around the city to talk about a pilot program that I was proposing. It was a voluntary program where we were going to ask our largest tax-exempt property owners to make a commitment to a voluntary contribution of 25% of what their tax bill would be. And again, I wasn't looking at, the survival center or small social service agencies. I was looking at large property owners that had a certain value, over $1 million in value. The city council passed a resolution endorsing that program. I had town halls around the city to get input. I had meetings with all of the key folks from those different institutions. And then I actually sent them a request to pay this voluntary payment because I can't compel them to do it. As I alluded to in an earlier slide, they all refused to participate in the program on an ongoing basis. Our 2 largest institutions, Smith and Cooley Dickinson, did make a commitment, a 3-year commitment, and gave, in the case of Smith, $100,000 a year for 3 years, and Cooley did $10,000 a year for 3 years. And so we got $330,000, which was, $330,000 we didn't have. And we actually, because that was not an ongoing commitment, we can't actually use it as a revenue. We do actually have other pilots, some smaller pilots. So whenever we sell those schools that I mentioned, we require that if it goes to a tax exempt that they sign a pilot agreement. So we do have small pilots. But the challenge is that our institutions and the way our law works is they are tax exempt under the law, and we can't compel them to pay property taxes only voluntarily. So that would take a change in state law. So I did make a major effort to work with those institutions to see if they would make an ongoing contribution, but they have not been willing to do that. I will also say that, in the case of Smith, you may have heard that under the Trump tax bill, there's now an endowment tax on institutions with large endowments, and actually Smith falls under that, so they are now paying a tax on their endowment. But that doesn't necessarily come back to the city of Northampton, and that's a federal law. So that's my answer to the tax exempt. I've been there, I've charged that mountain, charged that hill, and I only came down with $300,000, which is great. But I have had that conversation, and I was purposely trying to have it when we were not in a crisis situation. And I'm sure if you talk to some of those institutions, they have many pressures and struggles that they're facing as nonprofits. And so, so that's my answer. We have tried, and we did it very systematically, but they are not going to bail us out of this situation. Did you have... Mr. Kirby, and I'll come back here.
I'm interested in the tree program, 1,000 trees. What percentage of that was represented a new budget item, or how is it being paid for?
So Basically, when you looked back at our city budgets over time, when we had major fluctuations in revenue, including when Prop 2.5 went into effect, and then subsequent years went on, we slowly began to cut things, and we obviously tried to cut things that we felt were the least impactful or were going to be, most direct types of services. So everything from like the library hours I talked about, we made a lot of cuts in our schools. We no longer have librarians in our elementary schools. We cut music. We cut a lot of those things away, and we decided like we're just going to not put as much money into trees, into planting our trees. This was also a time when we didn't understand what an important role they play in terms of climate change and carbon sequestration and stormwater retention and just all the other benefits that trees provide. And so basically, and then we had things like the elm infestation, which took out a ton of our tree canopy, and we basically let our tree canopy fall apart. So I made a commitment when we made the charter change that we were going to really refocus on our shade tree canopy. We actually created the new Public Shade Tree Commission, which many of you have been following the work of. We created a tree warden, and I did put increased money into the budget to pay for replacement trees, because we basically were cutting trees down, but we were never replacing them. And that's why we suddenly had all these streets with no trees on them. So I increased the budget significantly for trees. And we've also, as part of the reorganization of the DPW, we have that tree warden that I talked about, and we created a forestry, parks, and cemetery division that's focused on forestry, our urban forest, our parks, and our cemeteries. We also, we've expanded a lot of our rail trail. We've expanded parks. We created Florence Field. So we put resources so they can do that. So the shade tree folks, and they've applied for grants too. We have gotten grants. We got a grant from the Commonwealth to do an inventory of all of our shade trees. We now have a computerized GPS inventory of all of our shade trees, and that's how we've been going out around the city with volunteers helping with some of the sweat equity, but it's been DPW staff who are then going out and making sure they're watered and making sure that we're pruning the trees that are already existent. So I could try to give you a quantifiable number, but it's been,
You can give me a qualified number after you had a chance to think about it.
Totally, yeah. No, we can definitely quantify it. It's
The problem
yeah.
I'm seeing is, like my wife hit me, there was a $220 bill from a surgeon tonight, is that we're getting older and poorer.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got an affordability problem, and part of the affordability problem of living in Northampton is the fact that our taxes are going up. Now, those of us that live in rental housing, they'll get the bill, and then they're gonna jack up the rent. And the older people dealing like me, dealing with the homes. So that's when I see this thing for a override, I feel poor. When I see like these DPW people running around in brand new trucks, it seems like the city is not acting as if they're inhabited by low-income people.
All I can say about that, Mike, is we have some of the things we've implemented, like in the DPW, for example, and our Capital Improvements Committee, which is a group made up of citizens who serve on the Capital Committee. We have a vehicle replacement schedule that we put into effect. That we look at our rolling stock and we look at making investments and replacing it, because when you drive around vehicles that are, made in the 1970s or 1980s and you're out plowing snow and they're spending more time in the shop or they're breaking down or falling apart. So we have made investments in our rolling stock, but it's all done with a vehicle replacement program that goes through our capital program. So yes, we have invested in new equipment. There's no doubt about it, but it's a pay now, pay later kind of a situation. And obviously things like ambulances and police cars and fire trucks, like we have to replace those. Like that's not the miles that they put on those every year. We can't have an ambulance breaking down. So we have vehicle replacement programs, and we follow those very carefully, and our capital program reviews them. So that is true. But I mean, the shade tree one, all I can tell you is that I've gotten so much positive feedback about this simple program about shade trees. And obviously it's the time we live in with climate change and climate mitigation, but that was an example of where the city basically, to save money, just sort of stopped paying attention to shade trees. And now we've invested in them. And I think we're leveraging that money with a lot of sweat equity from the community because they want us to replant our shade tree canopy. So I point to that as a success that we've been able to do over the last 7 years with the stability to do that. But everybody has their own thing that they like. Some people love the transportation program that we have at the senior center now, where you can call and get a ride to the senior center. Or some people like the expanded offerings at the rec department, where we've tried to keep prices down to make it more affordable to families. Some people like the new rail trails that we've been able to invest in. So everybody has something that they like, but all of us as a community are paying for it. And that's a decision that really is what's on the ballot on March 3rd, is what type of community do we want, and our budget is a reflection of that community. Yes, ma'am. I think you had a follow-up question, or you're all set?
Me?
Yeah.
I think I forget what it was. I think
Okay.
I'm all set.
Well, you can email me or, yes. I'm sorry, ma'am. You were next, and I'll come back to you.
It seems there've been 3 overrides in the last 10-ish years. It seems like a pattern is in place, and you've explained some of it. Do you see that you may be looking at this again and
well, what I really want to do, I mean, and during the 7 years, and I said this back when, I've said it in all my budget messages, I mean, I've spent a lot of time as a mayor with other mayors on Beacon Hill lobbying for new revenue, and reform, and more state aid, and more state funding, and more funding for our roads. We're fighting for the progressive income tax in Massachusetts, which is something that has been tried and failed. And that got shot down by the SJC a couple of years ago, so there's an effort to put that back on the ballot. So we are fighting, I would like us to move the needle so that we're not so dependent on property taxes. We should be able to create new revenue. And we've said to the state, many mayors, and I've said personally, like, if you're not willing to create the revenue, give us the ability to do it. Again, whether it's through Airbnb or through meals tax or through some of these other ways that people could pay for things that are not just falling on property taxes. So we'll continue to lobby for that. And the override to me is a last resort. And that's why, again, it's been 7 years, 7 years since I've come back to the taxpayers to ask us to do it again. So I don't want it to be a regular thing, but I do think the state should begin to give us more of our money back, and the federal government should give us more of our money back. When you looked at that chart of our general fund budget, I don't know if you noticed, there was a little sliver of federal revenue, it's like $180,000. So we get $180,000 in federal revenue as part of our $100 million budget. Again, if you looked at that chart 10 years or 20 years ago, it probably would have been 20% or more. Same with the state. So it's sort of a two-pronged strategy. We're trying to be efficient, we're trying to be conservative and be prudent at the local level, but we're also lobbying at the state level to give us more of our revenue and give us more opportunities to raise revenue. Because as I've told the legislators, like I referred to earlier, you may be holding the line on taxes on Beacon Hill, but that just means all of your constituents back in their community are having to pay more in property tax to fund schools and to fund city services. So it's really it's a false choice. So that would be my answer to that. Yes, ma'am, in the back row.
I want to talk about the schools. I found out lately that 2 AP teachers in chemistry and biology were eliminated from the high school. And that is outrageous because we need our AP classes. Then out of the middle school, 12 teachers left to go to other towns because they get paid a significant amount more than they get in here. None of those teachers are being replaced. At least I've spoken to a lot of permanent employees, and they say that they haven't had that. Also, you know, on TV, we had the vocational school saying that they didn't have that many applicants because the people that had, the children that had applied, their math scores were not that high. So I don't have access to the MCAS and see how it is, but I did find out from other math teachers that they changed the math program. So no longer kids are being, for example, master their timetables in 3rd grade and know how to do checkbooks and all kinds of things. And it's just troubling to hear that the scores are not high and that kind of situation, because the only thing that no one can take from kids is how much they know. And for them to be prepared to go to any Ivy League college and have an early decision, full academic scholarship, they need to have the skills in science and math and English and all these kinds of things. So it is really important that, you know, we as Americans are very generous. We like to help low-income people. We like to help other kinds of people. But in this room, all of us homeowners pay way more than $500,000 for our houses. So that means that we're paying a significant amount of property taxes to this town. Many of us, our children already finished college and they have excellent jobs. And we want to help. But the schools, for us to have high quality schools, we need to invest more money. And there's what we like to do with giving our money to projects that are generous, and what we must do to keep up excellent schools. And that is something that we really need to look at, because we cannot continue to feed all kinds of projects that are very generous and very good and not take care of our own. It's the kind of thing that we, for example, the chemistry lab that is so old in here, that money from marijuana that you have, that is only a certain amount for 5 years, you couldn't hire an AP chemistry teacher because you cannot hire her for just 5 years. That money, you can update the chemistry lab in the high school. You can do things like update the biology books and the math books that are more than 10 years old. These children need the opportunity to have high quality education. The teachers are already state qualified. They have advanced degrees. You have high quality teachers in this town, but you need the resources. And we need to use our money to keep up really high quality schools. We cannot just say, okay, I'm going to take an extra $3 million and throw it into this project, you know, which is very nice and very generous. But as I said, we have to take care of our own. Another thing is, I heard about the bicycle path, that's what I call it. You know, when I was young, my husband and I used to go bicycle riding Saturday and Sunday. They didn't have any path, but we had a reflective jacket from LOB. But, you know, I'm not 22 anymore, so I don't do that anymore. So we need to look at what we have and say, you know, in this room, maybe there are people here that still have children in school, but most of our children already finished college, and we're not servicing ourselves with the schools. But for me personally, and many people that I know in my neighborhood, schools are very important. And have high quality schools that they get, you need to think, how many early decision, full academic scholarships you have out of the seniors in this school this year. I know that when my kids were here, there was a large number because they had many AP teachers in math, in English, in chemistry, in biology, and now those numbers, they disappear.
So you've,
So what are we gonna do about it?
well, you've thrown a lot out at me, but I think the one thing I think we both agree on is, and I think most Northampton residents agree on, is that we value education and we want to invest in it, and we are investing in it. I mean, the things about AP classes, I hate to put Principal Valancourt on the spot, but I will ask you if you would like to respond to the AP teaching. And I mean, we have invested in all new math curriculum. We've got our curriculum director. We've been investing in new textbooks and technology and equipment and other things in our school. That's part of the capital program. But the principal is here, so she could maybe address the AP question.
So we did lose a chemistry teacher earlier in the year. However, we were able to hire a new chemistry teacher, actually 2 new chemistry teachers, and one we sent to AP training just recently. And he's AP training, yes, and he's prepared to teach AP chemistry all semester. He's currently teaching 3 honors chemistry courses, and we are also running 3 general ed chemistry courses. So we have lots of chemistry to offer. We also have, we're running 3 environmental science classes, AP environmental science classes currently, 2 AP physics, and 3 AP calculus. So we have a wide range of advanced placement classes offered in both science and math. That did happen, but we resolved it quickly because and biology, we also run
And
more
how
AP
about
bio.
your books? Are they still 10 years old?
Math.
Well, I can actually speak to the math program at the middle school. We have just decided upon a brand new math program that will help us to achieve all of the standards, and we will be including that as part of our discussion with the budget. So yes, we are working on that.
And we have brand new math books for the high school, for the integrated math program. They're new books, and every year, or every 3 to 5 years, we pay for, we renew our subscription for the online materials that go into textbooks. So they're pretty relevant.
And
they're
at,
very new.
and at the elementary school, we actually have math resource that is about 3 years old now. So that is also fairly new.
And how about the chemistry lab and the bio? The equipment?
Our chemistry teachers aren't currently complaining about the labs themselves. They're very functional and they have the equipment they need. And from my teachers, from my students, and from parents, I haven't heard concerns about the labs at this point. I'm open to hearing some concerns if you have heard them, but I haven't heard anything from the community.
The reason I'm asking you is that my daughter graduated from Smith College, and I remember the first time she went to a chemistry class, she came home and said, "Oh my God, Mom, you wouldn't believe the equipment that they have." Because here, her chemistry book and biology book was 10 years old, and the lab was incredible. And, you know, I'm not going to say pathetic, but it wasn't up to par. And I'm saying, with all the money that we pay in taxes in this neighborhood, we should have the best of the best.
Well, I think you'll find that we are still a top performing high school, and we have some of our graduates, because I go to graduation every year, still go to the top schools and universities and get early decision. And I have 2 daughters who went through the schools and are both in college now and are getting, had a great education, came to college really well prepared. One's a biochemistry major, one's an art major, had outstanding science teachers and outstanding arts instruction here at the school. So we offer a variety of instruction, and they're both doing really well where they are. But I think we agree. But the problem is, so when you talk about bike paths, for example, we fund bike paths with mostly state grants that can only be used to fund bike paths, or we use CPA, which can only be used to fund bike paths. So we're not, in many cases, we're not taking money away from the schools to fund bike paths. I think of all the bike path spending we've done, about 3% of it has been city money. Most of it has been federal grants, state grants, or through the CPA program. Thank you all for coming. So I think that sometimes it can be confusing when people see expenditures, that you have to understand where it's coming from and what it can be used for. So I appreciate your concern, but I think we actually agree that we need to invest more in education. And it's, again, at 55.5% of every dollar. We're doing that, but in order to keep pace with that, we need to keep our revenues strong, and so that's part of what this conversation is about. So I think we agree. So vote yes. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir, sorry.
Now, is Smith College and CDH paying their own water bill, storm
Yes.
water, sanitary?
Yep. They're not exempt from those. They're only exempt from property taxes. They're not exempt from any of those other fees. So they have to pay all of those same other fees that they're exempt from. Yeah. Yep. Any other questions? Have I worn you down? I realize there's a lot of information, but again, all of this is online and you can come to other presentations or just call my office or email my office. But yes, Fred.
You want to wait?
No, go ahead.
You have the graph that showed the levy over 10 years and that average increase was 3.5%.
That's correct.
How much of that 3.5% is new growth? If you were to make another graph showing just new growth over 10 years.
Well, we have a new growth chart. I could try to put that together for you. You also have to understand that we can definitely do that. I don't think.
Ask her the question. Maybe she knows.
Do you?
I don't know it.
She doesn't know off the top of her head. But we also have to understand in that graph, there's also some overrides that were part of that as well.
That's right.
That's right.
But
So.
I mean, what portion was just new growth?
We can certainly chart
goes
out.
up and down,
See, the problem with new growth is it's cyclical. So
Yeah, it goes up and
when you
down.
looked at that time when we had $4,600 in our reserve, new growth was like $100,000 that year because banks weren't lending, people weren't building things, people weren't expanding. So I mean, some of the revenue is very cyclical.
Yeah.
That's the challenge.
But I mean, you would have an average number for what the new growth was.
We could definitely show you that, and we've had that chart in other presentations, but I was trying not. Yeah, we've been trying not to overchart people.
I'll catch you at another meeting.
You sure will. This is your second one. You're gonna get a prize at the end of this.
I still don't understand.
Okay, well, by the 8th one, you're gonna be able to give the 8th one. You'll be able to substitute for me. Yes. So thank you all for coming. And again, this is a conversation, and if you have questions, let me know what they are, and we'll do our best to answer them. But I hope you'll think about the choice that we all have on March 3rd when you go to the polls on Tuesday, March 3rd. So thank you all again for coming.
Thank you.